Hello, and welcome to GatherVerse News Unscripted, where we bring you humanity centered tech journalism. I'm Lisa Bernard. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we bring you a pioneer profile. This is where we take an in depth look at someone who is working on Web3 emerging technologies and who is also mindful of the impact those technologies have on humans and society. Today, we introduce you to Sheri Byrne-Haber. Sheri is an expert in creating programs and systems to ensure that companies and executives are considering disability inclusion in their metaverse and virtual reality experiences. Sheri says ensuring accessibility is good for business. Here is Sheri Byrne-Haber. I'm speaking with Sheri Byrne-Haber for GatherVerse News. Sheri is an expert in disability inclusion. She has helped large companies launch digital accessibility programs. Sheri, to start with, what is digital accessibility?
Well, I could go on and on about the laws and the guidelines and the regulations that apply and put everybody to sleep. Or I could give you the simple sentence that Stephen Hawking, if he were still alive, needs to be able to use your software, needs to be able to make a customer support request. So it's all about making sure that software works for people with disabilities and the assistive technology that they use in order to access that software.
So to that end, he's one example. People have such a variety of disabilities. What are some of the ways you would like to see programmers address this problem?
So 1 in 6 people in the United States identifies as having a disability. And so sometimes you can see the disability, like me in my wheelchair, but 70% of disabilities are actually invisible. We have an international standard called WCAG, which stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it's broken down all the requirements into really individual bite-sized chunks. And the version that is current in the US and globally is version 2.1, level AA. And if you're following those 50 guidelines, then anybody who's disabled should be able to use your software.
How is accessibility a changing issue with VR and Web3 now?
Yeah, so right out of the gate, well, let's talk about Web3 and virtual reality differently because they kind of have a different set of concerns. Virtual reality has been out for a while, and there have been standards under the same organization, under WCAG and under W3C, that pertain to VR and XR. And it's simple things like somebody who is deaf needs to have captioning so they can understand what's going on. Somebody who's blind, if they're playing a first-person shooter game, needs to know what direction they're being, shot at so that they know where to turn the joystick in order to respond. The problem with Web3 is it's decentralized. And if you look at the zen of software development, when everybody's responsible, nobody's responsible. And so we don't see any efforts at this point, really significant efforts, in the Web3 organizations to adopt any type of accessibility standards. And so that's why I'm trying to work with the metaverse groups to say, hey, this is really important. You're going to be cutting out 20% of your users if you don't include some accessibility guidelines.
What would you like to see them do?
Well, I'd like them to take the existing guidelines and adapt them to Web3. Like I said, we know deaf people need captioning. You don't need to wait for a standard to come out in order to adopt that. Same thing for people who are blind who use screen readers. We know that they need the keyboard to function because they can't use a mouse. So there's certain common sense things that could be done right now. The problem is that the guidelines tend to lag the technological advancements. So we might not see a Web3 standard for 3 years or maybe more, by which time Web3 is already moving on to the next thing, right? And we get into this perpetual retrofitting mode where you have to build accessibility in after it's done instead of building it to be accessible from the beginning. And that's always more difficult, more expensive, and it results in an inferior experience for the person with a disability. Plus, they're left out for all those years while they're waiting for it to happen.
And so what I think I'm hearing you say is there are no regulations, there are no standards that are expected to be met in the metaverse, for example.
In the metaverse so far, there has not yet been any litigation. There has been one case involving VR and XR and captions that just settled literally in the last month in favor of the deaf plaintiff, where the defendant was required to provide captions in future versions. So again, litigation also lags the technology and the discrimination. And what I really want to see is I want to see people who are involved, explore this and get ahead of the game, build it into their definition of done and include it from the outset rather than waiting till they get sued and then figuring out how to jam it in at the end.
That's right. And you've argued in the past that it's better for business also, correct?
Yeah. I mean, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, hey, I'm going to exclude 20% of my potential audience today. But that's effectively what business owners are doing if they don't pay attention to accessibility from the outset with their products.
And in VR, so for example, you're in a wheelchair, to put on a headset, there are adjustments that are easy for you to make?
Relatively, believe it or not, my biggest disability for VR is I get motion sick at the drop of a hat. So that's more of an issue for me than the wheelchair use. But I do appreciate it, for example, when I can select an avatar that's a wheelchair user. I feel uncomfortable selecting avatars that walk because I don't walk. That doesn't represent who I am.
That's such a fair, good, important point. To know, it's so obvious, right?
You would think it's obvious, but I would say probably less than half of VR experiences that I've been in have the ability to select prosthetics, to select hearing aids, or to select a wheelchair.
Can you think of any success stories to share with us? Have you seen changes that have added inclusivity and have done the right thing?
Yeah, so over the last 14 months in particular, speech recognition has gotten much, much, much better. So Zoom, for example, the auto captionings are much higher quality than they were previously. Also, Microsoft Xbox is one of the big success stories of accessibility, where somebody with one finger can not only open the package and assemble the product, but they can also play all the games with the adaptive controller.
Are there ways that technology and even now the Web3 emerging technologies can improve the lives of people with disabilities?
Well, the first thing companies should be looking at is how many disabled employees do I have? It's really important to have a good percentage of diversity and representation of different types of disabilities, because those are the people that are going to help you build accessibility into your products, and those are the people that care the most because it impacts them directly. So look at hiring practices, look at retention, look at where you're recruiting. Are you recruiting from Stanford, or are you talking to Stanford's neurodiversity group? For example, there are ways that you can target recruiting to specifically include people with disabilities and make them feel welcome in your organization.
And I think it's true to say that foreign countries, India is ahead of us in this. Is that true?
Yes and no. I would say society-wise, India is probably not ahead of us. But India has made it a business of training people at companies like HCL and Magic EdTech and Cognizant, some of the larger Indian consulting organizations. They have specific accessibility practices. So if companies in the US have budget concerns, they can send their products to India to be tested by people with disabilities and then get the audit report back and say, okay, these are the things that we need to fix to make our product compliant with that WCAG standard.
What do you think is the most important thing for people to understand about disability?
So probably the most important thing to understand, other than the fact that so many disabilities are hidden, is that disability is a spectrum. Not everybody in wheelchairs are in wheelchairs permanently. Some people can walk, they just can only walk short distances, and that would be my case. Some people who are deaf use captions, other people who are deaf use sign language. So understanding that it depends when the disability occurs in your life. People who have lifelong disabilities like mine, we've had decades to adapt to the disability. If somebody got hit by a car and ended up with my level of disability the next day, it would be traumatic and sudden, and they would view it as something that they lost. So understanding the psychological impact is important. Understanding the spectrum is important. And when you have an environment that's welcoming of people with disabilities, then you're going to employ all kinds of people with those different needs and life experiences that are going to add value to your accessibility program.
Absolutely. And is this expensive? Are these changes expensive?
You know, that's one of the big myths about accessibility is, oh my God, it's compliance and it's just going to be so expensive. Some accessibility fixes are literally one piece of one line of code that can take 30 seconds to fix. Even the larger changes, if you include them from the beginning, if they are part of your design, it's not going to be more expensive at the end of the day. It's when you're done and then all of a sudden you have to go back and fix things, that's when it gets expensive. So that's why I always encourage people to think about accessibility as early as possible.
And that again was Sheri Byrne-Haber. Tomorrow, my guest is Frank Chindamo. Frank is the founder of the Virtual Reality Film School. Frank wanted there to be a film school that could open its enrollment to the entire world. Students put on a VR headset wherever they are located, and they learn from award-winning film directors without having to relocate to Hollywood. Frank will talk to us about some of his students in China and Singapore and show us some of their work. That is tomorrow at noon Pacific time, right here again. I hope you'll join me. Thanks for joining me today. Have a great rest of your day.